Hi, everyone. Great to have you here on the webinar with Linda and myself. Super excited, to go through this incredibly important topic today of measuring incrementality in brand media ROI through marketing mix modeling. So today, you have myself and Linda Cereda. Just to introduce myself quickly for those who don't know, I'm Jake. I started my career at Tesco, where I was working as a data analyst, and I slowly moved into a more strategic role within product. Then I moved to Farfetch, and I was there for around 5 years. But in my time, by the end of my tenure, I was a principal product manager leading the customer data foundations area. So everything with a 3-letter abbreviation sort of sat underneath me, from MMMs to CDPs to MMPs to single customer views. It was all pretty much within that role, and Farfetch had a pretty big media budget, and my job was to help define the strategy for increasing the incremental impact and also defining causality of how that spend was allocated and what the return on investment crucially was. And then the other part of that role was around how we effectively make personalized propositions for our end users, and how do we try our best to get real-time personalization on our different landing pages, which is definitely an aim of lots of businesses. And about 1 year ago, I took all of that knowledge from Farfetch and I launched my own data consultancy called Day1Data. And we specialize in marketing mix modeling, but also on the data foundation side too. And we've worked with some great clients within the CPG space, fintech, B2B SaaS, a real eclectic mix. And yeah, I'm super excited to present a bit more about marketing mix modeling today alongside Linda. And now I'll introduce Linda and let her give a brief introduction.
Yes, hello, nice to meet you all. I'm Linda Cereda. So as Jake mentioned, I spent the last 15 years in Nike, and I have almost 3 big chapters of my career. I started initially coming from consulting, investment banking, so as a internal a more strategy team. I did a lot of operation, marketplace, retail. So the first 5-ish years was a lot of general management skill, understanding really how the company works and how we make money. The second chapter was digital commerce. I led the sportswear business, which is lifestyle, digital business, not business, as well as I led the sneakers app, SNAKRs, which is a app for copying these kind of high-heat shoes. And then the last 5-ish years, I've been in data. I had a couple of roles. I led second data partnerships, so all the basically the work to get data from Zalando, JD Sport, Dix, and then the monetization of this data from not from a money perspective, but from a personalization perspective. And then the last role, I was VP of marketing data, where I led four pillars. The first one is the kind of MarTech stack, so customer data platform, Adobe Geo, which is journey orchestration for trigger comms, personalization on the apps and the site, as well as all the data science and ML feeding into that. The second pillar is squarely tied to what we're talking about today, which is marketing measurement, which is MMM, incrementality testing, A/B testing, as well as attribution. And then the third and the fourth pillar are more enabler to the first two, data foundation. And then I led a marketing academy, which is basically learning and development data literacy program, because as you will see later, I think you all understand, the literacy and the deployment piece was one of the pieces critical to get value out of measurement. So the reason why I mentioned a little bit more that is because from my background, I used to always sit in the business side. So I was under marketing. I never been on the tech side. So I'm very complementary to Jake's skill set. So I had people like Jake in my case. So I've always been on the deployment side, on the strategic side, on the kind of the business side, rather than the technical side. So, and with that, I think we can let it started.
Awesome. And yeah, so as Linda mentioned, she's going to focus on the deployment, the adoption of MMM, and I'm just going to quickly whiz through a brief overview of what marketing mix modeling is for those of you who are maybe slightly less educated on what the topic is. So effectively, it's nothing to be scared of. MMM is just a statistical model. And that can be built by statisticians, econometricians, data scientists, marketing analysts. There's so much education out there online nowadays as well, and so many communities that are being built. It's really being ever present, and it's becoming such a big feature of the marketing analytics stack. But effectively what it's trying to do is tell you the true impact of your marketing activity. So when you spend on all these different digital channels, on out of home, etc., you really want to understand, what's the impact that's truly happening, factoring in things like seasonality or price and promotions. The way I personally like to think about marketing mix modeling is that it helps you define what is the natural demand for your product or service. So if you strip back everything, so the impact of your competitors, your promotional spend, your SEO, really anything that might have a positive or negative impact on business performance, this is what we're trying to understand, what's the truth of what's happening. And hopefully you see your brand equity or your natural demand increasing year on year. But once you understand the truth of how each of these different business factors positively or negatively impact your business bottom line or KPI of choice, then you can start to determine the media effectiveness and use that for media planning. And that's kind of the core use case of a marketing mix model. So the one half is measurement and the other half is about optimization, continuous improvement. And whilst it's great to know exactly what's happening, that needs to be tied to a plan of action ultimately. So how can you use that day to day? And the typical thing is, how do we change our media budgets on an overall level? How do we reallocate budgets on a channel level towards channels which are more or less profitable in line with the business's aims? So the typical question you would receive if you're a CMO from a CFO is, what's the ROI on this investment that we're allowing you to have? And sometimes that question is a bit nuanced, because when you're investing in top of funnel brand activities, for example, an out-of-home campaign, or you could call YouTube maybe a bit of brand marketing, it's very hard to determine, the conversion, the uplift from that activity. And it's not enough to justify the spend by saying, we now have this much more brand awareness or preference or consideration. So you need to understand the financial implication. And that's really what this model is doing, telling you the truth so that you can make better media plans. So MMM is super powerful, and it works best when it's specifically tied to business use cases. And this is something that Linda's going to go into much more depth about. But those use cases could be things, if you started a marketing mix model today, you might leverage that for 2026 forecasting or Q4, media planning, for example. But really, if you have a varied media mix where measurement becomes a little bit more tricky, having something like MMM in your analytics toolkit can be a really impactful piece. And regardless if you do spend or don't spend on top of funnel media, if you believe that your business is quite heavily influenced by non-media factors, for example, the season or how much your product costs or what competitors are doing, MMM is a really great way of stripping back those non-media factors to help determine the media efficacy. And it's also super useful for things like omni-channel businesses or determining that long-term ROI, although there are some nuances when you do start to factor in, the long-term impact of the media. However, as great as marketing mix modeling is, it does have its limitations, and that's why it should be used as part of a wider measurement framework. And so some of these points listed here are more practical in terms of the use cases, and some of them are more in terms of eligibility criteria. So for example, on the use case side, marketing mix modeling is not the best tool in your arsenal to help determine keyword level campaign optimization. And on the other end, it's not great for startups, for example, who don't have too much media spend to inform a model or don't have too much historical data to help improve, the model's accuracy. So that's to say, MMM can be, wildly attractive for businesses to implement. However, there may be better options depending on what the use cases are or the maturity of the business. So with that in mind, when can you actually use an MMM? When would we as a data consultancy say, this is a great tool for you? And obviously, that is very much parallel and aligned to the use cases. If you don't have any use case, then you should probably ask yourself why you want this solution in the first place. But in terms of a more practical level, you need to have good data quality, especially with something like the KPI that you want to measure. So if you couldn't tell the model your daily sales split by region, for example, then maybe, an advanced statistical solution is not best for your business. And likewise, if you don't have a varied media mix, which means you're not spending on digital, top of funnel, PR, radio, etc., you're only spending on meta, perhaps there's better methodologies, for example, incrementality testing. And then the last two is really about, the power of the model itself. And if you don't have a high volume of spend and you don't have enough data history, then there's no way you'll be able to get a statistically significant model. So its predictive power will be significantly reduced. As mentioned previously, MMM is something that should be very much aligned to a wider measurement framework. So we used to call this in Farfetch our marketing analytics arsenal. So all the tools that we had in its disposal. And the reason why you need something like attribution, which is maybe like a multi-touch attribution, or linear or U-shape or first or last touch, is because that's much more of a granular, always-on view for businesses, whereas the MMM is typically run on a quarterly, half-yearly, annual, maybe monthly. We're seeing a bit more always-on approaches nowadays with some of the SaaS and AI advancements. And then your testing is used to effectively validate and calibrate both of those different models. So effectively, all of these tooling have its limitations. For example, within attribution, it's much more about directly clickable channels via UTMs. MMM is something that maybe you couldn't be able to run on a frequent basis. And then testing is the gold standard. And testing, which is seen as the gold standard of measuring or determining incrementality, is obviously super impactful, but there are certain reasons why you might not be able to produce tests on an ongoing basis. For example, business buy-in for a holdout test, or there might be super amounts of noise within a test, which means the design is just not feasible. But overall, all these solutions have their limitations, all of them have their benefits, but when used together, it creates a really impactful ecosystem. As mentioned previously, there's no point in doing a marketing mix modeling if you don't have access to a lot and a great quality of data. And it's especially impactful for the core KPI of the model, which is typically something like sales or maybe visits as well. And the reason why MMM is really impactful is because you're really throwing the kitchen sink of data into the model itself. You're taking data from obviously your media channels, but you're also adding stuff from the macro economy. So for example, inflation rates or interest rates as well, or anything on competitor. But if you changed your website in the last few years, we want to know about it. If you change your business model, if you change your pricing structure, all of these different data points are the most important feature of the model, and therefore the ability to communicate what features should be included is highly important, is paramount to the success of running an effective marketing effectiveness program. And then just a quick mention to the impact of brand marketing. And effectively, MMM can measure the efficacy of brand media. But what you really need is two things. So one is the data sources, as mentioned previously. So can you get data on all of the core KPIs which are needed to be included? So for example, did you run a brand uplift study? Could that be some data that we use into the model? If you run an effective influencer awareness campaign, are there third-party sources that could tell us the EMV? There's a variety of different scenarios where you'd need that relevant data. Even in the example of out of home, if you ran a campaign over a 2-month period, we would need typically from the media agency an overview of estimated impressions or eyeballs or footfall, what's actually being viewed. So you need to have the spend data associated with something, and then the impact in terms of the impressions, not the clicks. And then on the other side, there's a kind of boring, taxonomy classification associated with the brand media. So for example, within the media mix itself, what channels are constituted as brand media? You could use the example of YouTube. Is that something which businesses call top of funnel brand media? Same as like Meta top of funnel, same as doing like an out of home campaign or PR campaigns. We would need to know, the model would need to know, which media is actually constituted brand to be able to measure the impact of that. And then when it comes to long-term ROI, it is possible to do based upon the breadth of historical data that's being fed into the model and the amount of campaigns that have been run across that specific, activity or tactic. However, as mentioned here, the longer the time period, the confidence in that prediction typically diminishes. So to kind of wrap up all these different bits, MMM takes a lot of work to get right. It's not a simple process, and Linda will definitely talk to this, but the fact that it's cookieless, especially nowadays with IDFA and all the privacy laws, the fact that it determines incrementality without running a test, the fact that it measures the unmeasurable things like, brand media, retail media, out of home, the impact of competitors, and the fact that it's so closely tied to use cases in terms of forecasting and budget allocation mean that it's a really powerful weapon. And nowadays, there's so many options available to different teams. You can work with your media agency, SaaS tooling, consultancies, you can build it in-house. Meridian is a Google open source tool. Robin is the Meta open source tool. There's so much discourse online about using all of these things. And to make sure that you actually build a good one, there's 3 pillars, which Linda's going to talk about in way more depth than myself. But you have the accuracy, how good is this thing at explaining what the business is doing, how it's performing. And you can use different model metrics to infer that. And then crucially, there's the trust element. So how do you make sure that your stakeholders, the marketing teams, the finance teams will actually use the model? And typically that's very much associated with a measurement framework, to help validate and then calibrate that model. And then lastly, how do people use this thing? What are the strategies that's being adopted by a business so that people will actually, leverage these insights in decision-making processes?
Jake, can I ask a question here? In terms of adoption, do you have any example of what you guys are doing to help company adopting behind the processes?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that we have looked to bring in is a scenario planning tool. So what we acknowledge is that the market itself is changing and lots more teams are building products in-house and they use consultancies as well. But this thing that always sticks is, the ongoing consultancy, which is a bit of a burden in terms of time. So the one way that you could reduce that effort and allow people to really interact with the insights is by producing scenario planning tooling. And so what we've built is a slight, difference in adoption from what some of the other businesses have created previously by creating a tool for in-house teams. So the people in-house who have built their own models. So what they would actually just do is upload, a JSON, the output of their marketing mix model. And this allows the marketing and finance teams to be able to interact with their own MMM, irrespective of using the data team. So you can run a number of different scenarios and save these optimizations. You can, change the prediction time period. You can change the budgets per channel, add in different constraints. And then you can crucially, see the results, like what's this new scenario versus the previous, what's the uplift in revenue or ROI. You can create your media plan here, how much should be spent on each specific channel. And then crucially, you can get support in terms of spend phasing. When should I actually spend on this channel across the quarter, factoring in things like ad stock and media decay too. So we've tried to create a holistic tool for in-house teams so that they can produce their model which hopefully the stakeholders will trust a lot more because it's built in-house. You're not relying on a media agency or a third party. And this gives the internal teams the tools to effectively create media plans, actionable plans that can be shared and sent to the agencies, irrespective of using the data team from the day-to-day. And then finally, just before I wrap up and just give the microphone to Linda, where do I think MMM and attribution is going? It's a really hard one to say. I think it's definitely going to get more complex in terms of measuring the marketing landscape because of our clickless and agentic world and all these decisions being made in a super ultra optimized way, intra hour and minute, which is going to make measurement and budget reallocation super hard to track. But I think that's really interesting. I also think it's going to be a weird balance between leveraging software and trusting the expertise of marketers. And we already see that with some multi-touch attribution platforms, which a lot of the market seems to be moving away from. And then you have things as well like real-time MMM, which is definitely something which is more ever present than ever I'm seeing in marketing materials. And then crucially for the end consumer is the price efficiency. So leveraging AI to make the data transformation process super easy, leveraging AI to make the presentation of insights even more refined, which should mean that consultancies have a much more contemporary pricing approach compared to what they were doing previously. But that's me finished. And now Linda is going to walk us through, once you've got the model, how do you actually make sure that people use it, which is paramount to a successful MMM plan.
Good. Thank you, Jake. Yeah, so you can move to the next page. What I want to do before I go into the detail of MMM, I want to give a bit of a context of why at some point we started with measurement. Nike is a company which is traditionally, where brand is, is really brand marketing. So a very like top of funnel, very emotional, very, it's all about authenticity, connection with consumer. So traditionally, if I remember when I was in marketing 15 years ago, the only number we were looking at was brand strength monitor. So it's a quarterly survey about what's the coolest brand, what's the favorite. So that was basically measurement. And then kind of roughly 10-ish years ago, that's where Nike started to be prioritizing the concept of know and serve member at scale. So what you see here, images clearly from our DNA archive, and that's kind of the traditional way of Nike used to know the consumer and serve, like the salespeople, in this case was the first one, Jeff Johnson, where physically had a piece of paper for each consumer, taking notes, and then they were serving with the best shoes. Clearly, that was kind of the knowing and serve in an analog way in 50 years ago. And the idea was 10 years ago for Nike was to start getting more data signals. So that's where Nike started with the Nike app, Nike running clubs, data, some like early consumer data platform efforts. And that's where we started to be a bit more serious about marketing measurement. But then the acceleration came around 4 years ago when Nike started to make quite significant investment of the MarTech stack, so between the CDP and different types of toolings. And these are like, as you can imagine, multi-million-dollar investment. And that's where kind of like I wouldn't say scrutiny, but the importance of like measuring whether this incremental investment were driving returns became much more accelerated. And that's where kind of my role started, was basically like try to become a bit more disciplined about measuring the return on investment. So this is kind of the history. You can move to the next page, Jake. At higher level, how is Nike using MMM? It's very similar to what Jake was mentioning. So MMM is a piece of a triangle of 3 pieces. So MMM is used for like higher level, like measurement, budget allocation. That's this piece. The second leg, it's testing. So A/B testing, incrementality testing with holdouts. And we have a quite significant teams and offense around that. And then attribution for the read and react, week in, week out, month in, month out. In terms of MMM, we use it to looking back, so measurement. So how did we achieve? Did we achieve the KPI? Yes, no, are we missing them? And then we use it to look ahead for scenario planning, budget allocation. So we use it primarily for kind of 3 years planning, 1 year planning, so the long-term planning as a budget. And that's where we use a kind of like, we started to implement literally physically templates we provide to every geo function to look at the number and help to inform decision with some data behind it. And then the second piece is for quarterly business review, so QBR, to look back. So what you see in the top right is clearly covered. We want to show a confidential number, but basically we align on a scorecard of like, what are the KPI we want to measure, and then how much incrementality was driven by marketing. So what you see there is top of funnel, brand kind of reach, demand, engagement, and that's kind of how we have to align across function between CFO, CMO, Nike Digital Commerce, Nike Digital, membership team on what is the measure of success is. So this is kind of how we use it. To go to the next page, I wanted to make it very concrete in terms of like, how does this triangulation approach concretely means? So I'm going to make a very pragmatic approach without giving away too much sensitive information. But the first piece, it's if you go to the left piece, it's we start to use MMM to identify opportunity to optimize at a macro level at full funnel. So when you look at the first thing we learn is that, yes, marketing drove incrementality, which was, it was good to know. Between 20 and 50% of KPI were driven by marketing, depending on which KPI. But we also uncover quite a lot of inefficiency in the way we're spending. So one thing is that when we look at the incrementality, was really, really driven by paid, which you can imagine that a company like Nike, which has such a strong brand awareness, organic is important. It's a brand where typically you would think you shouldn't pay for traffic and pay for basically demand as much as other brands would do. So when you look at the way we were spending paid, was we were using paid dollar from the top of the funnel or the beginning, but we knew less about member, as well as in the bottom of the funnel when you have like loyal member, where we have a lot of first party data, zero party data, second party data. And the idea is that if you have all these amazing weapon in your arsenal because you have a lot of data, you shouldn't spend too much demanding paid. You should actually leverage and get more money out of your own channel. So that was the first things. And then one of the other insights is that when you look at the funnel, the buyer progression, zero purchase, 1, 2, 3. One thing we saw is that there was a huge gap, 0 to 1. So a lot of people download them up, especially or become a member. But then there was a vast majority never made a purchase. And then the other piece is when you get consumer to the third purchases, the chance to get to 4, 5, 6 was super, super high. So the idea is, how can you get as fast as you can to these magic 3 numbers? And it's interesting because we did our own data science analytics, but then I've been talking recently to other companies, whether it's food retailer or membership. It seemed that the 3 is kind of the magic number across a lot of industry. But that was kind of the big insight we got. As you can imagine, that's macro level, but then you need to start optimizing the work. So we move to the second pillar, which is like, okay, if you want to start to get closer to the 3 purchases, what are the most valuable action that you want member to perform? And that's where we start to use data science. We have a model called LTV Bounty, where we took 50 actions and we tried to attribute a dollar value of each of them. So downloading the app, it's LTV X dollar. Being shopping from store to digital, it's Y dollar, etc. And then we rank all these actions, and then we identify what are the most valuable. So again, without giving too much away here, but like in general, shopping omni-channel, so from store to digital to store, there was a high value action. Or shopping across dimensions, so you go from footwear to apparel, from soccer to running, that was another value action. Or being contactable. Contactable means we can send you an email. So of course that was a high value action because we are able to actually communicate with you in a way which is relevant. Or downloading the app, it was another value action. So we use this, which is number 2, to move to number 3 on the right, to start developing journey to trigger and lead to this high value action. So for example, one of that is like, okay, O2O is a highly value action. So how can we trigger this? And we build journey for like a women consumer which buys a bra or a legging in the store. How can we trigger a replenishment online? Of course, typically you can imagine it's a bit more difficult for a woman to buy the first brand online because they want to try. Once you know your size for the brand, it's easy to just replenish it. So that was one of the most successful triggers, for example. Or the onboarding journey. Once a consumer gives an email, what should we do in the first 30 days, 90 days? Again, try to trigger this behavior to have the consumer try to do sport, Nike running club, Nike training club, or buy sport. Because again, as you see, like if you don't do anything in the first 90 days, it's very difficult to basically go back and trigger this behavior. So that's where basically paid need to come into place. So this is a kind of example. And then of course we use attribution to say like, okay, we have these triggers come. Are these higher, do we have higher conversion and click-to rate, etc.? So this is more the weekly reader react, which is again is not about incrementality, but more to be able to have a pulse check on whether these more personalized channels, which are by definition smaller segments and smaller audiences, are delivering higher return. So hopefully this is a kind of a high level enough, but it's also understanding a bit of how we went from macro MMM to, again, data sciences, to journey, and to attribution. Good, we can measure, we can move to the next one. So this is where, again, I try to grade myself in terms of like, how did we did the work in terms of like focusing more on MMM side. And just to be like, give a bit more context, we started, it was kind of a two plus year journey when we started. Nike initially had an MMM model, which was done with a kind of out-of-box tool from a vendor a few years back, so when we started to be a bit more serious about measurement. But at that time the deployment was very little, and I can tell a bit more about that. There was kind of a couple of reasons. One was a project led by analytics only, where marketing team were not really that engaged. And as you can imagine, like if it's only an analytics type of project, it's very difficult to get to decision-making change. And then number two was a bit too higher level and not granular enough for Nike, with the complexity of like a wholesale, DTC, different apps, different platform, different channel, to make it actually actionable enough. So there was a decision, again, when I talk about the acceleration of measurement effort, to in-house a model. So that's kind of the first piece on the tool. One thing we did is to have like a phase approach. So I think one of the probably the biggest learning is start small and try to start where typically what we define where to start is a few factors. First one is where data foundation is solid. So of course you can start to fix everything from data foundation. So start where the data foundation is there. And then the other thing was a bit more a softer element of like starting where we think we have the biggest ambassador and the best ambassador. So so in our case, for example, we started from North America, paid channel, then we went from North America, EMEA, APLA, paid, and then we went to on North America, and then we extended. And typically we started from where we thought we also, not just the data foundation was better, but also like we have the bigger chance of success because the leadership team there was actually already kind of aware of how to use MMM. People came from other company where they used it before. It's much more easier to have at the beginning. As you can imagine, change is difficult for everybody. So you want to try to maximize the success for early return. And again, the people element is important. So that's what kind of the tooling. The second piece of the process, and again, this is the boring piece and nobody wants to talk about. Unfortunately, I wish you could say you just buy a vendor, a SaaS tool, and everything works. Unfortunately, the biggest effort is the wiring of the tool into the company. So this is where we were able, after a few quarters, to consistently deploy the tool in corporate processes as well as marketing processes. So corporate process, I think, is similar in any company, whether it's 3 years planning, year planning, budget, it's kind of a quarterly review. That was kind of the typical processes, as well as a marketing process, like whether it's a quarterly alignment between testing journey or the weekly reader react, but you want to embed the tool into your processes. The second piece is people. The third piece is people, which is why I put yellow, because that's probably where it was the biggest amount of effort and takes, of course, a lot of time. The number piece there is secure sponsorship from the business leader. And what I mean there is that in our case, the ownership kind of moved from analytics to marketing. But honestly, I don't think who owns it doesn't matter, whether it's a person or the other one. Especially in our case in Nike, it's a very consensus-based company, so nobody ever owns anything. But the point is, even if the project is led by analytics team, that can be working. The problem is, the important thing is you definitely need to have a sponsorship at the business level. So if the marketing team doesn't care about changing the way they make decisions, you can have the best MMM model, you're never going to be able to drive a result. So that's the first thing about security sponsorship. And then the other piece is investing significantly in change management, data literacy. And again, for us, you might be lucky to work in a company where people are data-driven. That was not the case in Nike, and honestly is not the case even now. So we had to spend a lot of effort and time into like education. What is MMM? Explain in a very, very simple way, not in a technical way, but why we need to look at incrementality. Even incrementality as a KPI, as a measurement, was new to us. So that was why we created this academy to, again, make very simple from the super senior level to the manager level of what we were looking at, and then how you use the tool. And then the last piece is tools for deployment. That's why I made the question to Jake before. This is where I rate ourselves red, in the sense that what we had for MMM, for example, was a scorecard. You saw it before. It's a static PDF. It's a deck. But so that's kind of what was our tool for deployment. We have to rely on an insights team to basically explaining the story, like what has been driving, what has been growing, why, etc. So one thing which I think for me, ideally what we would have wanted is, one is to have like dashboard or self-service tool where I can actually get deeper myself without relying necessarily on the insight team, and actually leave the more strategic insights work to the insight team, instead of like just asking them to help reading and react to the numbers. Or in ideal work, maybe 1 year, 2 years from now, when the technology is there, is to even use LLM and say a language model where I can ask questions to the data, like what has been driving the growth? Why? What should I be doing? And then talk a basic English word instead of like, even looking at charts. And for us, I think the reason why there was a bit of resistance in dashboard is not because we couldn't build dashboard. It was actually much more of a cultural reason, where the insight team didn't trust yet the marketing team to be able to self-serve. And again, no criticism to them, because it's true, the marketing team was not traditionally very data-driven. So it was not about like we couldn't build a dashboard. It's more like there was a bit more resistance to like letting the marketing team be able to read themselves. So the idea was let them educate a bit more, and then we can give them a tool where they can self-serve themselves. So again, this is kind of what we did the work. And I think in the next page, I kind of try to extract a little bit of like, if I go back 3 years ago, like what do we think is a checklist for calling a deployment successful? So starting from the top level, it's you want to have a business-led approach and sponsorship. So it doesn't mean that your CMO need to have technical expertise. They don't need to know, the detail about what is MMM, but they need to be at least vested enough to being able to commit to change decision-making based on this. If they're still using the tool and then they make decision based on gut, it's very difficult for any team to get success out of measurement. Second piece is aligning on the key outcomes. Again, this is very generic: incremental demand, engagement, effectiveness. For us, took almost like 2 quarters to even align on the KPI between the CFO, the CMO, the digital commerce team, the membership team. So this is dependent on the company. For us, it was quite critical. But even that's all the reason why we align on that scorecard. And then the first time we had it was like 50% of the page was actually white because we didn't have a number. But then at least we kind of progressively fill it quarter by quarter. But at least people philosophically already got what was basically the vision for success. And then the pieces below are kind of all the enablers. So you want, of course, a measurement toolkit between MMM, testing, attribution. Again, you don't need to do everything together. It's very difficult. For us, ironically, we started from testing, then we went to MMM, then we clean up attribution. So it was not really a linear way, but eventually you want to get to like more than one tool. Second piece is data foundation. Again, user phase approach. It's very difficult. I never heard a company say, we have amazing data, 365 days a year. You might fix something and then 3 weeks later, something breaks. So to me, it's more like, what are your MVP? What are the minimum data that you want to have clean? And start then where the value is higher. Third piece is deployment tool. Again, that's why we didn't have, honestly, great, amazing tool. Fourth element is people, strong partnership across function. This is not a analytics project. This is not a marketing project. This is not a finance project. It's actually a cross-functional effort. Training problem, change management, and then consistent communication. This is where, at the end, I was kind of a broken record, but keep reiterating. I think, if you hear any learning on change manager, typically people want to hear things 7 times before they remember. So that's why we start to like quarter in, quarter out, keep repeating until it becomes something that people remember. What is incrementality, how to read it. And then the other piece is, again, wiring the tool into the process, whether it's 3 years, 1 year, QBR, testing, ceremony, etc. That's a piece which is critical. So this is where I think if you are working on MMM today, one thing that I would invite you to do is like, where are you green? Because you might say, we have amazing in the toolkit, but we are amazing people get it, but we haven't really clarified which process needs to be changed. So typically, again, you don't need to do everything together, but typically one thing that you see between process, people, tools is that the speed of deployment depends on the lowest common denominator. So you might have a tool which is amazing in 1 quarter. If you take you 9 months to educate people, you're still going to take 9 months to get there. So like typically you want to try to go the same speed, or at least don't go super fast in one and forget about the other two, because you're going to be slower or creating frustration that is not pleasant to have. So maybe to move to the next one, I think this is where I think it's actually, I led different type of transformation, whether it's machine learning, whether it's measurement, whether it's digital commerce. But typically what I've been experiencing in my life is that the best tool is not the best AI, the best model that drives the highest ROI is typically wiring the tool which is appropriate to your company, your use cases, into the company process and people. And sometimes I get your vendor pitching all the time. We have this SaaS tool and you're gonna be amazing in 6 weeks. And I'm like, I wish I could say there is a tool can do that one. I have never experienced. If you have seen something, please share it your way. I'd love to learn. But typically when people try to underestimate the effort into a process and people's, I think you've seen a lot of like research, whether it's BCG or other consulting, typically they say for $1 put into a tools and tech, typically you need 2 in processing people, not really from a budget, but more figuratively from an effort perspective. And this is kind of the metaphor I use. You can have a Ferrari, but if your goal is you're in a small street in Italy, the gas station is closed, you can't go very far. So you might be better off with a 500, but you have a full tank. You have somebody driving, which is a people. You have the data, which is a fuel, and you have roads to drive, which is a process. So this is maybe like the simplest way to explain it. And again, like I wouldn't say it was an easy journey. I wouldn't say Nike is perfect. We're very far from there. But I think it's kind of like we prove that you can do things, even in a company where traditionally marketing is very like creative and very brand focused than other companies which are much more data driven. So with that, I believe I am done with this. So I'm going to hand it over to Jake for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, awesome. Maybe I can tackle the first 2, and then Linda, you can finalize the last one. But yeah, ultimately, we just wanted to conclude this webinar with 3 main takeaways for all of our listeners. So MMM is awesome, but it needs to be utilized as part of a broader measurement framework. So that includes, pure play attribution and also incrementality testing. As Linda also referenced, the second point is around the data foundations. So if you don't have the right data and the right classifications, you can't measure brand effectively. If you want to have an accurate model, and if you want to have a model which can produce frequent insights without massive cost towards the business in terms of time and effort, then you need that data foundations layer as well. And then Linda, do you want to finalize on the sponsorship?
Yeah, I think we just mentioned the metaphor before, but I think it's the number one is secure your business sponsorship. Why your ambassador, what are the people that can help you with this effort from a change management, and then investing time and effort into the wiring in the tools, which again, the boring part that nobody wants to talk about. And you don't hear any conference talking about this, but it's unfortunately the part which is, I think it's fundamental to get the deployment turning into value for the business. And
so there you go. MMM, it's great. But if you don't have it as part of a more mature measurement framework, if you don't have the data foundations and you don't have the holistic business sponsorship, then maybe you should consider, operationalizing those areas before kicking off your MMM program. We actually don't have any time for questions, unfortunately, but we're going to send out the recording to everyone after this session. So yeah, feel free to connect with myself on email, There's a LinkedIn QR code. You guys have seen Linda as well. Please feel free to connect with her too, or add her email into the follow-up as well. So yeah, with that, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Linda, massively. Grazie for presenting. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks so much.